Hello friends, my name is Ryan, and today I am going to tell you a story named The Russian Sleep Experiment, the ultimate horror of the Soviets' madness. This is a very amazing story full of twists and turns, and I promise you, by the end, you'll be left in awe. So, let's begin. It all started in the bleak, shadowy depths of Soviet Russia, where strange experiments were often conducted in the name of science. The year was 1940, and the world was on the brink of war. But behind the closed doors of a secretive Soviet facility, something far more sinister was brewing. The story begins with 5 prisoners, each chosen for their physical strength and mental fortitude. They were selected not because they were criminals, but because they were expendable. They were told they were part of an experiment to test sleep deprivation, under the guise that it would enhance human capabilities during wartime. The experiment was classified, and the prisoners were given no choice but to comply. They had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. The experiment was to last for 30 days. They were locked in a room, with a special gas designed to keep them awake, pumped in through the ventilation system. The first few days were uneventful. The prisoners complained of feeling tired and disoriented, but they were given little to no comfort. The researchers behind the experiment watched from behind a one-way mirror, noting every detail. But things began to take a terrifying turn on the 4th day. The prisoners started to speak of strange hallucinations. They saw shadows moving at the edges of their vision, heard whispers in the corners of the room. Their skin began to pale, and their eyes bloodshot, filled with terror. They begged the researchers to stop the experiment, but it was too late. By the 7th day, the prisoners were no longer behaving like humans. They had begun to lose touch with reality. They screamed at each other, eyes wide with fear, and at times, they would burst into maniacal laughter. Some began to harm themselves, pulling out chunks of their own hair, while others scraped their skin raw, desperate for some release from the unrelenting, sleepless torment. Then came the most horrifying part of the experiment. On the 10th day, one of the prisoners, a man named Dmitri, started to speak in a strange, guttural voice. He said things that no one could explain. "The darkness speaks to me. It wants me to stay awake forever." His body began to twitch uncontrollably, and his face distorted into something unrecognizable. As the days stretched on, the prisoners grew more unstable. They stopped talking to each other, their voices now mere whispers, filled with madness. Their bodies were emaciated, their skin hanging loosely from their bones. They were no longer the same men who had entered the facility. They had been transformed into something monstrous, driven to the brink of insanity by the horrors they were enduring. The researchers grew concerned, but their orders were clear. They could not stop the experiment, not yet. They watched in a mix of curiosity and fear as the prisoners continued to deteriorate. They had crossed a line that could not be undone. The horror that unfolded in that small room was beyond anything they could have imagined. On the 15th day, something even more terrifying happened. One of the prisoners, a man named Ivan, turned to the others and whispered, "They don't want us to wake up. They want us to die." And just as quickly, he fell silent, his eyes rolling back in his head. The others stared in horror as Ivan's body twitched violently before collapsing to the ground. His chest rose and fell erratically for a few moments, but then it stopped entirely. He was dead. But the worst was yet to come. The remaining prisoners became even more paranoid. They could hear things now, scratching, whispers that grew louder, louder until they could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of their shattered minds. And then, on the 20th day, something far more horrifying than death itself happened. One of the prisoners, a man named Nikolai, began to scream. He clawed at his own face, tearing at his skin, screaming for someone to help him. But there was no one. The researchers had long since retreated into the safety of their observation room, terrified of what they were witnessing. Nikolai's screams became unintelligible, guttural sounds as his body contorted in unnatural ways. His limbs twisted at grotesque angles, and his spine seemed to stretch and bend like rubber. His eyes bulged out of his skull as if they were going to burst. It was clear that he was no longer a man, but something else entirely. The remaining prisoners tried to escape, but they were too weak, too broken by the madness that had taken hold of them. They were trapped in that room with no way out, with the shadows and whispers closing in on them. It was only a matter of time before they, too, would succumb to the horrors of the experiment. On the 25th day, the researchers made a shocking discovery. The prisoners had stopped moving altogether. The gas that had kept them awake had finally taken its toll. But as the researchers entered the room to inspect the bodies, they found something that defied explanation. The prisoners were no longer dead. They were something else. Their eyes were open, staring into nothingness, yet they were still breathing, their chests rising and falling with every breath. But they did not react. They did not move. They were like living corpses, trapped in some kind of eternal nightmare. The researchers immediately shut down the experiment, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The shadows, the whispers, they were real. And they had followed the prisoners, carrying the horrors of that experiment with them. As the days passed, the researchers began to hear strange noises coming from the abandoned facility. Whispers in the night. Shadows moving in the corners of their vision. Some say that the prisoners, or what was left of them, still wander the halls of that facility, searching for an escape from the horrors they endured. Others say that the researchers who were involved in the experiment disappeared without a trace, taken by the very madness they had unleashed. And so, the story of the Russian sleep experiment became one of the most chilling tales in history, a cautionary reminder of the horrors that can come from the darkest corners of the human mind. The Soviet Union may have crumbled, but the whispers of that experiment still haunt us to this day. But friends, before you go, I ask you to remember this story. If it left you feeling uneasy, if it stirred something deep within you, then you are not alone. These stories are meant to keep you awake, to remind you of the dark places that exist beyond the veil of reality. And if you want to hear more tales like this, tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, then make sure to subscribe to our channel. Because the horror, my friends, is just beginning.